Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Selby Nimrod, Assistant Curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, and I am delighted to welcome you to Interspecies Attentiveness, a panel discussion in conjunction with the exhibition Symbionts, Contemporary Artists and the Biosphere, which is on view in the galleries upstairs until February 26. In tonight's conversation, artists Špela Petrič, Alan Michelson, and Miriam Simun will look at human collaborations with other species and the role of digital media can play in facilitating our pursuit of ways of knowing, thinking, and communicating beyond the human. Before I dive into bio introductions of our presenters and moderators, I just want to first go over some information on program access. In addition to the in-person conversation here in the Bartos Theater, this program is being live streamed with live ASL interpretation, and a video recording of tonight's program with closed captions will be made available on our website at a later date. I acknowledge that this event is taking place on the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. I acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory. I ask that we take a moment to honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people who have been the stewards of this land since time immemorial, as well as the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. Tonight's program will feature presentations by artists Miriam Simun, Špela Petrič, who couldn't join us today in person, but has shared a pre-recorded contribution, and Alan Michelson. Their presentations will be followed by a moderated conversation with my esteemed colleagues and co-curators of Symbionts, Caroline A. Jones and Natalie Bell. Alan Michelson is an internationally recognized New York-based artist, curator, and writer and lecturer, and a Mohawk member of the Six Nations of the Grand River. For over 25 years, he has been a leading practitioner of a socially engaged, critically aware, site-specific art, grounded in local context and informed by the retrieval of repressed histories. Sourcing from both Indigenous and Western culture, he works in a varied range of media and materials, among them painting, sculpture, photography, sound, video, glass, and stone. He is the recipient of several awards, including an NEA Visual Artist Fellowship, Native Arts and Cultures Foundation Artist Fellowship, and the GSA Design Award Citation in Art. His work is in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum of American Art, National Gallery of Canada, and the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. Alan's practice includes public art and Mantle, a large-scale monument honoring Virginia's Indian nations. That was recently dedicated on Capitol Square in Richmond. Michelson is co-founder and co-curator with the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School of the Indigenous New York series. Špela Petrič is a Ljubljana and Amsterdam-based new media artist who has been trained in the natural sciences and holds a PhD in biology, currently working as a postdoc researcher at the Smart Hybrid Forms Lab at Vera University, Amsterdam. Her artistic practice combines the natural sciences, wet biomedia practices, performance, and critically examines the limits of anthropocentrism via multi-species endeavors. She envisions artistic experiments that enact strange relations to reveal the ontological and epistemological underpinnings of our biotechnical societies. Her work revolves around the reconstruction and reappropriation of scientific methodology in the context of cultural phenomena, while working towards an egalitarian and critical discourse between the professional and public spheres. Petrič received several awards, such as the White Aphroid for Outstanding Artistic Achievement in Slovenia, the BioArt and Design Award in the Netherlands, and an award of distinction at the Prize for Arts Electronica, Prize Art Electronica, Austria. Miriam Simun works at the intersection of technology and the body, ecology, technology, and the body, spanning multiple formats, including video, performance, installation, writing, and communal sensorial experiences. Trained as a sociologist, Simun spends time in communities of experts, ranging from biomedical engineers to breastfeeding mothers. Taking on the role as artist as field worker, much of the process is rooted in research as lived experience, forefronting corporeal and sensorial ways of listening, learning, and knowing. Simun is a recipient of awards from Creative Capital, Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, Joan Mitchell Foundation, Foundation for Contemporary Arts, as well as a 2022 Lebec Artist in Resident, a 2021 Onassis Foundation Fellow, among many other awards and fellowships. Simun's work has been recognized internationally in publications including the BBC, New York Times, The New Yorker, CBC, MTV, Forbes, Art21, and Art News. Simun is a graduate of the MIT Media Lab, ITP at NYU Tisch School for the Arts, and the London School of Economics and Political Science. I will also offer some hopefully briefer bios of our moderators. Natalie Bell is a curator at the MIT List Visual Arts Center, where she recently organized exhibitions of Leslie Thornton, Matthew Angelo Harrison, Raymond Boisjoli, and Shrestha Premnath, and co-curated Symbionts with Caroline A. Jones and myself, Selby Nimrod. While at the New Museum, she co-curated several major group exhibitions, including The Warmth of Other Suns, Triggered, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon, The Keeper, and Here and Elsewhere. Bell has edited or co-edited more than a dozen publications and published herself widely. Caroline A. Jones is a professor in the History, Theory, Criticism section of the Department of Art and Architecture at MIT, also serving as an Associate Dean for Strategic Initiatives in the School of Architecture and Planning, also at MIT. She studies modern and contemporary art with a particular focus on its technological modes of production, distribution, and reception, and on its interface with sciences such as physics, neuroscience, and biology. Her writing has appeared in journals ranging from Art Forum to Critical Inquiry to Science in Context, and she is solo author of several books and exhibition catalogs, as well as a co-editor of volumes that examine technology and the senses, art and neuroscience, and art history and history of science as parallel inquiries. Her research has been supported with fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Humanities Center, the Institute for Advanced Studies, the Radcliffe Institute, the Max Planck Institute, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Social Science Research Council, among others. So, before handing over the floor to tonight's presenters, I would also like to extend my sincere thanks to them, many of whom traveled to be here today. Thank you also to Senior Manager of Campus and Public Programs, Emily Garner, and Program Assistant Elizabeth Ponce, who organized tonight's event, as well as to MIT AV for their technical support, and MIT Video Productions, who provides digital access for all of our programs. Okay, well, without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Miriam Simun.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be a part of the show. I'm very happy to be in conversation with all of you tonight. So the first transcendental moment I had with a plant was the first time that I saw the Agalanthus acuta bloom. It's the only federally protected endangered plant that grows in New York State. It blooms one day a year at dawn, and by noon, the petals are already starting to fall. And at daybreak, this really amazing thing happens. So just as the flowers are about to open, just as the sun is beginning to come up, suddenly from nowhere, all of these bumblebees appear. And they're just going flower to flower, like they're so big that the flower is bending under their weight, and they look drunk in ecstasy. And then just as suddenly, 20, 30 minutes later, the flowers are open and they all disappear. I've made different works inspired by this experience, including here you can see in 2017, bringing 12 people to a piece of land in Montauk on Long Island that Andy Warhol donated to the Nature Conservancy. And they had to come at 5 in the morning to watch this flower open. And this is for a work called One Day in the Land of Tribute. And the Land of Tribute is the meaning of the word Paumanok, which is the Algonquin name for Long Island. And the Algonquins played an important role in the both cultural and natural history of this plant. So this is the Agalanthus acuta. It has many interesting stories. I wish I had time to tell you all of them now, but it has one in particular that also relates to the work I have in Symbionts. So it was protected in 1988. And in 2008, the biologist Dr. Mei-Li Neal conducted genetic analysis on the flower and discovered that according to taxonomic geneticists, the flower doesn't exist. So it's considered genetically the same species as a flower named the Agellinus decemloba, which was discovered or named by humans first. And so according to taxonomic regulation, the second name falls away. That species doesn't exist. Except even though the decemloba is also very rare by now, it's the Agellinus acuta that's protected by law. So most scientists, or all scientists that I encounter, just ignore this inconvenient scientific fact. So when I asked Dr. Neal, this person that kind of totally changed the trajectory of this one tiny species, how did you start working on this plant? Why were you interested? She told me the story of just being on vacation on Cape Cod, and a friend invited her to the volunteer counting of the flowers. And she also witnessed this bumblebee dance that I told you about. And she was also just so in awe and so inspired that she wanted to know what the bees were smelling and feeling, and she wanted to know more about this flower. And so the bees kind of seduced her into fundamentally changing the natural history of this plant, and also into increasing, in some ways, the existential threat it faces. Because if developers catch on to this taxonomic snafu, you can imagine that its protection can be threatened. So this is the first time that I started to think seriously about the power of bees. So the flower is so small that its scent is imperceptible to humans in the wild. I worked with chemists and with perfumers to capture the odor molecules and use mass spectrometry to analyze and recreate its scent. I'm interested in science as a form of interspecies communication and collaboration. What happens when we explicitly frame it as such? How does this reframing cast scientific methods and ethics in a new light? Can science, kind of fundamentals, I think, to much of my work is the question is, can science with a capital S, the one that guards the authority on truth, make space for alternate ways of seeing and sensing and knowing and thinking with other species? Karen Broad writes that measurement is a form of touching. So I'm quite obsessed with the idea that then the inverse is true, that touching is also a form of measurement. So I created the Adoro. It's a wearable sculpture that holds the scent of the Agellinus acuta to your nose as part of a ritual performance to attend to the extinction of one tiny plant. But also I'm just realizing lately that maybe it's also just some attempt to try to chase this experience of bee ecstasy that I witnessed. So the work found its way, after being shown in different places, to Shanghai, where the Adoro was worn here both by a journalist on the news and by Bruno Latour, who we lost recently, and who's an important thinker in my work, and who wrote the seminal book, We Have Never Been Modern, which questions the categories we create within the project of modernity, most crucially the distinction between nature and culture, and asks how we can understand things to be, in fact, complex and entangled systems of nature, science, culture, technology, capital. So this flower that conservationists couldn't get to propagate 3 meters away from where it was growing, like it was growing on private land, and just 3 meters away was public land, and they couldn't get it to move. And now, if you entertain my proposal that its scent, the chemical marker of this species that we created, can be understood as some kind of continuation of its being. So if we entertain this proposal, now art world machinations brought it to Shanghai, halfway around the world. In this light, the exhibition participates in the life of the species, and the museum becomes a very specific site of interspecies communication, which Symbionts is quite an amazing show, I think, to think through these questions. I ended up making an entire new body of work inspired by this idea that the Agellinus acuta continues to propagate around the world because of its transformation into an artwork, even after in its vegetal state, it goes extinct. This installation imagines a sort of future garden where the distribution mechanism is no longer wind carrying seed, but the art world spreading the flower to new places. So the scent is in the water vapor being pushed through these sculptures and through the room and through the bodies entering the room. It's made up of a series of work called corporeal downloads and a video titled Wet Chemical Trace that attempts to imagine the perspective of the flower, now turned scent, spreading through bodies and space inside of water vapor. And the garden fuses the aesthetics of flower bodies and human bodies and the lab materials we use to capture the Agellanus acuta's scent, where scientific processes and cultural ones and natural ones become impossible to pull apart in what constitutes this flower. But back to bees. These are frozen bees that I tried to bring as a kind of offering to pollinate the 320-year-old king of pear trees in Dangshan, China, the pear capital of the world. Most of them never awoke. Biomimicry is defined as the design and production of materials, structures, and systems that are modeled on biological entities and processes. The cigarette filter here is meant to mimic a bee's fuzzy body, to both collect and release pollen. This is a human pollinator at work, pollinating pear trees. At Harvard's Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering, roboticists are building intelligent swarms of tiny robotic bees, a very different biomimetic design. So I was interested in these two, and big air quotes here, solutions for colony collapse disorder within the industrialized agricultural system. I decided to investigate pear pollination, as pears are one of the oldest cultivated fruits. We have records of Chinese pear cultivation from 7,000 years ago. In China, also, the pear symbolizes both immortality and prosperity. But also, because of the omen the pear presents in Chinese culture, pears are never eaten during Chinese New Year. It's considered bad luck, as the Mandarin word for pears, li, sounds very similar to the word for leaving or parting. Crucially, I need to understand what all this means also corporeally. So while making the film Interspecies Robot Sex, which is on view in the galleries, I was also daily doing the work of pollination to understand what this is with and inside my body. And it's interesting because it's actually really, really boring. And it's also really, really hard to remember which flower you've already pollinated and which one you haven't. And this is in direct contrast to the first chapter of Survival Trilogy, of which Interspecies Robot Sex is part 2. The first film is called Imagine Lines and Alibis, and it's about hunting and shooting and skinning and eating a jackrabbit. And when I started out on that work, I thought I would be horrified by having to shoot an animal and have to end up becoming a vegetarian. But the opposite happened. My body came alive in this exhilarating and terrifying way, and it was amazing to me that I could sit there for hours, scanning the landscape, waiting for something to move, just so I could shoot it. Something turned on in my body-mind, and this pollination experience was not that, was very much the opposite of that. At least in my experience, I found that our brains are certainly not evolved to do the work of pollination. At the same time, this beautiful scene full of flowers is actually literally breathtaking once you enter it, because you're completely overpowered by the stink of metallic fish. And without knowing what that was, my body immediately understood that it was poison. The scent betrays the pesticides. The story enters through the nose. So at the larger farm, the second farm I worked at is the largest fruit orchard in the world. They use chicken feathers instead of cigarette filters. This is Su Lan Lao, collecting flowers to extract pollen. Later, Lao will show me how to rub the flowers together to release the pollen, gather it in a newspaper, and hide it under my bedsheet. I sleep with the pollen for the next 2 nights for heat treatment. Lao is one of a 2-person family farm in Sichuan that I worked with. She's been hand pollinating for years and is motivated to use pesticides and then do hand pollination because pears are how she makes a living. I may mention this because interspecies relations are fundamentally entangled with questions of class and capital and survival. And I mean, this is a much bigger topic than I have time to get into here now, but it feels important to note. This is one of the day laborers in Dangshan, the largest fruit orchard in the world. So 7,000 people come for around 5 to 6 days every year to pollinate these vast orchards. They have a bit of a different motivation and also a different level of thoroughness in their pollinating. The workers are paid $30 a day, but even at this cost, the labor is becoming too expensive to keep up, and farmers are beginning to turn to crops that don't require cross-pollination to propagate. This is the pear-picking woman of Zhangqi. That's the inscription at the bottom. This is in Sichuan, where they have a different solution: to extract capital from pear trees not through produce, but through tourism. And so the invention of the traditional Pear Blossom Festival, where narratives of tradition are invented and enacted in order to cultivate symbolic value of the pear flower. I'm actually super fascinated by this point at which the symbolic value of a species is worth more in terms of capital than the caloric or nutritional value of a species. And in turn, if this tourism works, it might be actually great for the bees, because there'd be no need to use pesticides anymore if you're not worried about fruit production. This vista was directed by the director of the Pear Farmers Collective, who kind of took over this pivot, I guess, to tourism. It was redesigned to be viewed exactly from this place, which was completely newly paved viewpoint at the moment I was there. And you can see a bit, kind of in the middle of the image, some green Chinese characters in the yellow fields, which spell "most beautiful pear town" out of canola flowers and wheat. This is the robo-bee, kind of designed under this idea of bio-inspired engineering. One way to think about it, it's the site of a different kind of extraction from non-human species. While many bee species go extinct, we study in deep biological and mechanical ways the exact shape of their evolutionary design and mechanical functions from a physics perspective, so that we can learn from their bodies and use these designs in the creation of our own robots. This, one could say, is also a form of interspecies communication. But perhaps framing it in this way asks us to find a better style of communication with our communication partners. While one of the potential uses described for the robo-bee is artificial pollination, it's unlikely that these specific machines will be pollinating crops. They're simply too expensive to produce. There are already other AI-aided machines, less mechanically complex, being used for pollination in agriculture. Potential uses for the robo-bee listed on the VIS website include reconnaissance and operating in extreme and dangerous environments. And the US Air Force, Navy, and DARPA have all been involved in funding this research. And so the story ends here with the drone metaphor folding back in on itself. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines the word drone in 3 ways. I'm just going to play that one again. A stingless male bee that has the role of mating with the queen and does not gather nectar or pollen. 2, one that lives on the labors of others. And 3, an uncrewed aircraft or ship guided by remote control or onboard computers. Thanks.
Hello?
Hi, I'm Špela Petrič, and I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there with you today in person. But I would like to share some thoughts on Scotopoiesis. That's the work that is on display within the Symbionts exhibition, and also some general thoughts on my engagement with plants to hopefully contribute to the topic of interspecies attentiveness. So Scotopoiesis was the first in a series of works titled Confronting Vegetal Otherness, during which I explored plant alterity. I was originally triggered by my own plant blindness because while I rationally knew that plants are beings that enable all other life on Earth, I still saw them as most of us do, so as green scenery or living material. But I was drawn to explore, on one hand, this failure to relate to plants in a way that we can do with some animals, but also to challenge the status quo. So I set out to make a series of performative experiments that would enact unusual relations with plants, and not so much with the intention of revealing some insights to the audience, but as manifestations of honest, authentic questions I myself had. So within these experiments, I first and foremost wanted to avoid perpetuating the objectification of plants. And at that time, it appeared to me that using any technological mediation would lead to plants once again getting brushed aside or swallowed by the interface, allowing us to consume them in a form that we are already very comfortable with. That is through the apparatus. So for this reason, I steered clear of using sonification, time-lapse, measurements of their physiologic reactions, or anything that felt like a translation of plant being into human scales. Anything that would make them neatly fit into the spectacle of the secret life of plants. Now, ironically, it is precisely these devices I will use later on in the subsequent artworks. But at that time, I was focusing on communing with plants through material and semiotic exchanges. So it might be revealing to introduce my background. Before I started working as an artist, I studied biology and later earned a PhD in biomedicine. So it came naturally to me to operate in the abstract schematics of science, which can through training so vividly represent material phenomena that they almost become identical with them. So when thinking of the most respectful way to bridge the divide that appeared to separate me and plants, I considered what I knew of plants from science and what science knows of their perceptual milieu. And I tried my best to enter it. So I knew that plants do not only use light as an energy source, but also sense light using proteins that are similar to the ones in our eyes. And this light triggers a signaling cascade, a semiotic pathway that is just one of millions that stack on top of one another and interweave to create an epiphenomenon that we call cognition. So, while casting a shadow onto plants, I could visualize the molecular processes happening, even though their spatial and temporal scales are beyond human senses. And this was weirdly where I situated the intercognition, full of respect for plant being, as I felt I was not projecting my humanness onto them. And while I can joke about this today, at the moment of conceiving Scotopoiesis, I had not yet realized The experiment wasn't really devoid of an interface. It was just that I had internalized the apparatus which I was using, and I'm referring here to, of course, scientific knowledge, to the extent that it became invisible to me. For this insight to precipitate, it took years after the first performance, and also the experience of the other works from the Confronting Vegetal Otherness series. But the insight remains with me, not just as a critique of how science indoctrinates values, but also how all conceptual apparatuses and technologies we use covertly delimit the relations that we make. And also how difficult it is to grasp this from within. But on the other hand, this realization was also freeing in that if it's not really possible to deny your epistemological or ontological legacies, there is value in examining them. And as we keep quoting Haraway, there is great value in staying with the trouble. So, in the next triptych of works called The Plant Machine, I consciously embraced the mediated plant. Specifically, the plant caught in the gaze of the algorithm. Now, at first glance, it is hard to imagine how computation could do anything for changing our relation to plants for the better, as it is so good at objectifying through deification that leads to commodification. But to me, it's presenting finding a common plight with plants. What I mean by this is that we, as in humans, plants, and all other phenomena, find ourselves on one side of the flattening relational condition that digital technology creates, since it operates with indifference to the kind of bodies or processes that it follows. Or in other words, in relation to the algorithm, we might as well all be plants. If I think about these significant shifts in my capacity for interspecies attentiveness, the first one, of course, was brought about by spending the time standing in front of Cress and realizing that a protocol of practice can outperform rational or emotional efforts of trying to connect with plants. And the second one came from realizing that instead of empathy, which by definition we cannot feel towards creatures that are dissimilar enough from us, commonality of relations can be a very generative stand-in for it. So instead of empathizing through the identification with the other, we recognize similarity in the conditions within which we operate, bringing the focus from identity to relationality. And so in The Plant Machine, I did just that. I explored common plight by speculating on the implications and possibilities of transposing technologies designed for people onto plants, and vice versa, adapting sensors and logics of precision agriculture to insist on an open-ended, non-utilitarian application for plants that I would appreciate for myself as a human. So, for example, we had LipNet, an open source lip reading AI trying to interpret what microscopic plant lips or leaf pores are saying, or potted plants, potted house plants that were able to be mined for behavioral surplus via a drill machine interface that enabled their cellular activity to be measured and reported on by smartwatches. And finally, we made an AI-controlled robot whose purpose was to play with the tentacles of cucumber plants in their plant time. So, taking these works as a series, it becomes clear that it is the qualities and implications of technological apparatuses that are in focus. And that for me, the post-humanist project to rescue plants from the background has been substituted by an urgency to push and stretch technology with and for our vegetable others, as we do so for ourselves. But to conclude, the plant machine doesn't only take seriously the power of the apparatus, it also strategically taps into its potential for enchantment. So the time-lapse is a cinematic medium that has been used since the beginning of the 20th century to conjure what Oliver Geiken calls the electric vegetable. Initially, it was used to scientifically demonstrate the behavior of plants through their movement, but soon after, the technique migrated to popular contexts, because this bridging of timescales is inherently charming. So, in the work Play, the time-lapse of the cucumbers and their tendrils interacting with the bouncy balls, controlled by the AI, is generated in real time and played back on the robot's computer screen, with the last frame of the loop capturing the viewer so that they may catch a glimpse of themselves as they stand before the seemingly still life. This flicker of the human self creates an unstable bridge between the timescales of the electric plant and the electric animal. And I would like to link this back to the 24-hour continuous performance that is the capture of the scotopoesis, which you can see in the exhibition. There, the logic of the time-lapse is turned on its head, yet to similar effect. The human figure fools the viewer into thinking that what they're seeing is a still image, only to be startled by the occasional twitch of the body or readjustment of posture. And while the recording was made to be able to archive and later mediate the process of the full duration of the performance, which is why it also has the pauses and darkness inside it, the contrast between plant time and human time is strangely conserved, which I think transforms the video from documentation of a performance work to an artwork in its own right. So I would like to conclude. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to listening to the recording of the conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Caroline, Natalie, and Selby, for producing such a fascinating exhibition, catalog, and series of events. In 1989, I was invited to do a temporary outdoor sculptural installation by the Public Art Fund, and I immediately knew the site I wanted to work with. The former site of a large, spring-fed, freshwater pond in what's now Lower Manhattan, adjacent to Tribeca. This is a late 18th century view of it by Archibald Robertson. On its western shore was a monumental shell midden, communally built from generations of indigenous feasting on the spot, which the Dutch colonists called kalkhoek, or shell point, later corrupted into collect by the English. The original main source of drinking water for the colony, of fishing and skating in winter. In the 1700s, the collect was drafted into service by colonial industries like distilleries, tanneries, and slaughterhouses, who located themselves on its shores and poisoned it with their waste, including tannins and animal carcasses. In less than 2 centuries, this pristine pond and its marshes, host of a flourishing pre-colonial ecosystem of reciprocal human and non-human life, was reduced to a stinking eyesore and health hazard. And rather than clean it up, the decision was made to drain and bury it. The creek that was its outlet to the Hudson was converted into a drainage canal that was later filled to become Canal Street. They removed both the hill in the image, which is Bayard's Mount, and the shell midden, and used them to fill the pond along with its surrounding vegetation. There was briefly a scheme to develop the land created by the project into a residential estate named Paradise Gardens. But as the vegetation they added to the fill rotted, it produced a terrible stench. So they built a notorious prison and execution ground on the site in a neo-Egyptian mausoleum style that people nicknamed the Tombs. The collect was poisoned, buried, and its gravestone was a prison. At the time, I had I'm not sure this is moving forward. Can someone advance the? There we go. At the time, I had a residency at Snug Harbor Cultural Center on Staten Island, a former sailor's home, and one of the country's best Greek revival complexes. I used to spend time at the pond on site, and at some point I was moved to take castings of its muddy banks, of the tracks of the blue heron that frequented it, or the raccoons, or the cattails and other plants, but also the broken bottles and weird trash. This led to Earth's Eye, my piece for the site of Collect Pond. In a pocket park surrounded by courts and the present tombs, the Manhattan House of Detention. To augment the cast from Snug Harbor Pond, I made casts of objects associated with the history of the pond, a group of 40 in concrete I arranged in the shape of the pond shoreline that included deer tracks, oyster shells, skates, tools, reeds, and more. Can we have the next one? Back one, yeah. Including this one of flint corn, referencing the Lenape cornfields that once graced the area. This project brought home to me the broader extent of the destruction wrought by settler colonialism and its extractive mindset, and its effect upon multiple interconnected species. This is the work in the exhibition. It's called Wolf Nation, and this piece originated in an invitation in 2018 to create a work for indicators artists on climate change at Storm King Arts Center, a 500-acre sculpture park and museum in the Hudson Highlands. And it got me thinking about the history of its land, once part of Lenape-Hoking and the homeland of the Munsees. Like the Mohawk, the Lenape were divided into 3 matrilineal clans. In our case, wolf, bear, and turtle. I'm a turtle. And theirs, wolf, turkey, and turtle. And the Munsees were wolf clan people and known as such. It struck me that not only did the Munsee lose their homeland to colonization, but so did their wolf kin. Like the resident Munsee, the wolves who inhabited the region were considered savage obstacles to the colonial project and were similarly attacked and driven off. Their common homelands were converted into colonial space, the spatial fixity of private property, with resources to be exploited. Ethnically cleansed from their homelands, the Lenape became a diasporic nation, as did their wolf kin. I wanted to do a work honoring our clan-animal relations, and it started watching the 24/7 webcams at the Wolf Conservation Center in South Salem, New York. And I visited the center, a nonprofit environmental education organization working to protect and preserve wolves on Turtle Island through science-based education, advocacy, and participation in the federal recovery and release programs for 2 critically endangered wolf species, the Mexican gray wolf and the red wolf. Prior to colonization, Munsee and red wolf territory overlapped, and I became immersed in watching the footage of the pack of red wolves at the center. They were beautiful animals and exemplary in their communal family relations, and yet only a handful survive in the wild, all of them wolves who had been similarly raised in the federal recovery and release program. I realized that even more unfortunate parallels existed between their fate and the fate of their indigenous human kin, also confined on reservations and endangered. In an effort to symbolically free them and send an urgent message on their behalf, I took a section of found footage of the center's red wolf pack, cropped it into panoramic format, which is also the format of indigenous wampum belts, changed its full color to the purple and white palette of wampum, slowed it down, and collected audio of wolf sounds, which I commissioned White Mountain Apache composer and musician Laura Ortman to make into an all-wolf soundtrack. I titled the piece Wolf Nation, which was also the title of my 2019 solo exhibition, curated by Chrissy Isles at the Whitney. And it was also shown last summer and fall in Enmeshed, an exhibition at the Tate Modern, and was also screened outdoors in the Ecstatic Land exhibition at Ballroom Marfa last fall. Can we have this clip? This is it at Tate. It was in the area they call the tanks, which are these, were these huge concrete tanks. It was a power station at one time, and the sound just reverberated in that beautiful round space. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, so these are wampum belts, and they were an important element in indigenous culture and diplomacy. Long belts woven of hundreds of tiny purple and white beads made from the quahog and whelk shells into symbolic designs. They were often embodiments of agreements, but could also be war declarations. This is a display of belts at the Woodland Cultural Center in Brantford, Ontario, the Museum of Six Nations of the Grand River. Next one. This is Sapong Kanakan, which is a site-specific augmented reality piece I did with artist Stephen Fregali for the lobby of the Whitney Museum at the time of my show, a ring of tobacco plants based on those in my sister's garden at Six Nations Reserve. The Whitney is located at the former site of the Lenape fishing, planting, and trading site of Sapong Kanakan, which translates as tobacco field. And the piece commemorates it as an indigenous site. Through a free app Stephen designed, linked to GPS, visitors could access and engage with the virtual plants via their smart devices. And there were 2 stations in the lobby with iPads that anyone could use. Could we have, there's a brief clip, could we have that next? It would sort of pop onto the floor, depending where you were standing. And you could actually sort of walk through them. Yeah. So tobacco, like the Three Sisters, corn, squash, and beans, have been indigenous staples for ages. There's evidence that of these staples, tobacco may have been cultivated first, which demonstrates the importance of the plant, which was used ceremonially rather than recreationally. The strain we grow here on Turtle Island is different from the strain grown for the tobacco industry, which originated in the Caribbean and was first brought north in 1610 by John Rolfe of the Jamestown colony, husband to Pocahontas and founder of the Virginia Tobacco Project, which was deeply implicated, of course, in African and indigenous enslavement. Could I have the next slide? Indigenous middens, like the one at Collect Pond, once dotted the landscape up and down the East Coast until they were either destroyed for shoreline development or the shells burned for lime or used as fill. They were more than mere piles of trash. Some contained burials and some were built into rings, monumental ceremonial structures. They were testament not only to the natural bounty of the area and its hundreds of miles of shoreline, but to the sound ecological practices and traditional knowledge of the Lenape and other indigenous communities over millennia. A midden that was unearthed in the late 90s up the Hudson and Dobbs Ferry was dated to 6950 BCE. Over the years, I've done a few projects that involve exploring indigenous waterways that were converted into industrial canals and shooting moving shoreline footage from boats. When I was invited to show in the last Greater New York exhibition at MoMA PS1, I had the idea to explore the areas of New York Harbor that were once some of the richest oyster grounds in the world, shoot footage of their present shorelines, and project it onto a midden of oyster shells. Some of it is from Newtown Creek, a Superfund site, and the rest from the Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn. These are the oyster shell piles of the Billion Oyster Project on Governor's Island. Billion Oyster is the brilliant nonprofit organization with whom I partnered on this work entitled Midden from 2021. What they do is regularly collect shells from dozens of area restaurants, cure them in piles, and reintroduce them back into the harbor in the form of oyster reefs, which they seed with oyster spat. A single oyster can clean up to 50 gallons of water a day, and their goal is to deposit 1 billion into the harbor. These reefs also help against storm surge and the effects of the crazy effects of climate change. The soundtrack is a recording of the songs of the Ganetwe, or the Lenape skin dance, which were entrusted for safekeeping to my Haudenosaunee ancestors by the Lenape during a period of colonial cultural upheaval. As such, these songs are also site-specific, the songs of Lenape-Hoking, the homelands of the Lenape. I structured the video according to the song structure. It plays when the lead singer is singing and pauses, revealing the bear shells when he engages with a call and response with his fellow singers. All of them are Mohawks from Akwesasne. I'll conclude my presentation with this brief clip of Midden. Can you? This piece is going to be in the Gwangju Biennale in April, and I thank you all for your being here.
Well, that was really profound. Thank you both so much. And thank you to Špela, whose virtual participation I think was about as great as they get. I have a lot of reflections and thoughts after taking that all in, I guess, but maybe one thing that emerged right away is this really difficult but powerful task of not anthropomorphizing other species and thinking about ways that technology can be useful in that task. Alan, I'm thinking about your use of surveillance footage as something kind of technological but neutral in a sense. It's not a camera that's being operated by you yourself. And I wonder if you'd like to kind of respond to that choice of a medium, and Miriam, if you want to build on that as well.
Yeah, well, in my case, can you hear me? I'm not sure. Hello? Okay.
There you go.
In my case, I mean, the surveillance is usually sort of creepy and, it has a sort of malevolent aspect to it. But in this case, they're trying to keep these endangered wolves alive, and they're sharing their doings with the public. So it is invasive in a way, but it's also, I think, bringing attention to their plight. So I think there's, sort of a benign aspect to it. And I sort of performed some sort of, judo on it or something. So, by removing it from its context where you see them, that there's a fence actually behind them, to me it was an act of sort of symbolic freeing. So I think that, digital media, which, is in a way very neutral, maybe the neutrality is somewhat exemplified by something like a webcam. It's just this eye. But I think you can do other things with it and to it that can then help other sorts of projects, projects that are trying to preserve and defend. Yeah.
think it fit for me really strongly in Špela's comment that she wanted to move from identity toward a kind of politics of relation. Because as a receiver of the work, and in your comment tonight, there's obviously a relationship between the surveilled and the preserved that is not unlike the Native American reservation, right? It's protected, it's, preserved, and it's surveilled. So you both have the artistic freeing of the wolf for our contemplation.
But I don't think there's a conflict between relationality and identity. I think identity is relational. So I think that was one of those, I didn't see the
That's a good response to her.
dividing line there.
Miriam, do you have any thoughts about, for example, the drone that you ended with is creepy, surveillant, alien, and yet also somehow be like, and anyway, I think Natalie's question is also good.
Yeah. This question of kind of anthropomorphizing or, for example, trying to imagine what the flower might feel now that it's a scent wafting, or other works I've made that are trying to get close to understand or imagine the perspective of another species. Fundamentally, it's impossible. And the more I do it, the more clear how impossible it is. And yet, this attempt feels really important to enact.
Mm-hmm. Well, I observed too how you described originally the kind of drunkenness of these bees, and that too in itself is a kind of anthropomorphizing in the sense that it's mapping on a human experience onto this other species, but in a perhaps a good way, because it's serving as this kind of entry point to pique your curiosity. And then I'm also thinking about the role of embodiment in your work in general, which is different from anthropomorphization, but is somehow about corporeality and gaining access through that.
Yeah. I think perhaps, I wouldn't, perhaps that's a way forward. I don't think through corporeality you avoid anthropomorphization or these kinds of things, but through ways of knowing that are not fundamentally linguistic and structured through language, I think maybe we get somewhere closer to understanding other ways of being in the world that we might share with non-humans. And at the same time, just to say, with the drone, I do honestly think that to study the bee in such a hyper-specific, exactly what is the shape of the wing and how this affects exactly how it flies, is also a way of getting close to it. Mm-hmm. Even if they're not aware that that's, what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I found that was fascinating that you were reaching out to these flowers, through these really subtle means. And other artists in the show have been dealing with sort of micro organisms and so forth. It's a lot easier to sort of relate to a wolf, or anyone's had a dog can relate to a wolf. And today is Groundhog Day, the only holiday named after an animal. So I think we're pretty good with four-legged,
charismatic mammals.
Yeah, though the groundhog isn't, and apparently it's also misnamed, that it's also called a woodchuck, right? And it comes from a Anishinaabe word, maybe, that's ochuk or something, that actually means fisher, another animal. So it was sort of misnamed by the colonials.
No surprise there.
Yeah, not a surprise there. But yeah, it's really interesting. Also, Petra's, communicating with plants on this level. She was standing out and casting her shadow over plants, and then over a long period of time
Right.
for those who haven't seen the show. And that's just amazing to, you know, the plants playing with the balls and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
It's wild stuff, so, you know.
Yeah.
I think mine was much easier to relate to in a
Well,
way.
you know, coming back to the film and the
Yeah.
digital film that all three of you end up deploying, I'm struck by this history in which watching plants with movie cameras was a significant part of generating algorithms about growth and planning animation software. And, you know, so Špela's play with the time lapse versus, you know, what is human time, what is plant time, I thought was quite interesting. And I wondered if either of you have thought of your digital video work in terms of, you know, these different time shifts that you might be thinking with. I mean, you obviously approached it with the Tobacco Project in the sense that the plants are just there, right? We don't have a moment where they sprout, or do we have a moment
There's a
where they...
moment where they sprout. It's quite magical looking. You know, you're looking at
Yeah.
your phone, and suddenly, or your pad, and suddenly they pop up.
Yeah,
But you know, they popped away too, right?
Right.
I mean, they were there for
Right.
probably thousands of years until the Dutch took over that part of what's, you know, it's now called Greenwich Village. It was Sapon-Canacan, and ironically, it was one of the, you know, Dutch governors of the colony, Van Twiller, who then grew the commercial tobacco on that. He bought that plot and he grew commercial tobacco there. So there's all these sorts of layers of history, I think, that, you know, that history in my case, I think I'm, you know, with the oyster middens and things like that, it goes back millennia. And the pond was there for some 15,000 years after, you know, after the glaciers receded until, you know, it was colonized, and then it was 200 years it was gone. So, I mean, I think we're at a moment of crisis now where I think everybody realizes it, and the question is, are we going to have the courage to, you know, try some different things? So.
powerful. Yeah.
Well, I think that is also, I mean, another thought I had was just this undercurrent of loss, and how that's informing both your, I mean, a number of your works for both of you, whether it's the, you know, the honeybee colony collapse or the loss of oysters and wolves, and also the traditions that supported and sustained those human and animal and plant relations. And I was really struck by what Špela said about having a kind of turning point in coming to think about technology as actually being something that can help us insofar as we start to apply the same technology in our thinking about animal, or in thinking about plants and working with plants as we do to human life. And that's a really complicated thing, because I think, you know, especially in the arts, a lot of us approach technology often with a really extra healthy dose of skepticism. And I know that that skepticism is present for both of you, but I wonder too, you know, insofar as it can be a positive or productive force, like how do you think of technology as having some beneficial potential in relation to all these difficult subjects and the prospect of loss and collapse throughout our ecosystem?
Well, for me, it wasn't just loss. It was like the Billion Oyster Project and projects like that are smart and that are taking, you know, what used to just turn into landfill or something like that, and restoring waters, restoring harbors and things like that. So I think that's the future. And that's our, you know, sort of hope for the future, people thinking through things like that.
These are technologies of attention also. So the webcam, surveillant, you know, creepy, but it's a technology of attention that is meant to bring people's awareness to this species. So I think my favorite part of Špela's presentation was the use of a lip-reading AI to be brought to the stomata of vegetable pores. I mean, because I love the idea of just forcing this anthropomorphic technology to make sense of plant mouths opening and closing, you know. So I think, you know, this is an old idea, but the kind of detouring of technologies to tell new kinds of stories. I mean, I think that's what both of you have done. We haven't talked about Miriam's bench, but you know, it's a technology meant for human ears that is addressing itself to human derrieres, human bottoms, human gluteus maximus. There's humor there too, but there's also these become technologies of attention, technologies of confronting a different kind of semiotic system. You know, we become so fascinated by what the wolves are saying to each other. And one aesthetic choice that came up in some of my students' commentaries that, you know, might be interesting to ask both of you about, because you're both very gifted filmmakers, is the choice to use non-environmental sound versus the choice of using environmental sound. In other words, you detach the wolves' sounds from the wolves' images and made a composition that floated over the images. Was that a conscious aesthetic choice, or was that just something that came when you were working with Laura Ortman, which was its own creative?
Yeah, I knew I didn't want it to be just, you know, I wanted to transform the sort of realism, if that's what it is, of a webcam, you know, just that sort of dumb witnessing, and make it into something different, and make it into something that would sort of give the wolves, you know, amplify the wolves in some way that wasn't just expected. You know, when we, it's interesting, all this communication aspect of things.
Yes.
Like, I'm not sure, I mean, we might want to talk with plants. I'm not sure they want to talk with us, especially with what we're doing to, you know, their sort of fellow plants that aren't doing so well. I think they communicate with their roots and stuff. Like, don't trees do that to help each other out? So we're, you know, I would just like, probably the plant message, you know, in the plant universe is like, stay away from those humans. They'll just fuck you up, you know? So I think, you know, I'm not sure if they want our attention. And those wolf howls were not for us.
Right.
Yeah.
They could be, though, if they were wild and we were prey.
Yeah, I mean, they'll
could
actually howl
definitely-
with you. You know, you can evoke some, you know, species, but that's a little bit like, I don't know if you could do that in the wild. Maybe you can, you know, but you certainly can at Wolf Conservation Center, because I've done it. You know, like they almost lead it, like, okay, everybody howl, and then the wolves howl, you know, and it becomes a circus act a little bit. But they keep the red wolves and the gray wolves away from that, so that they're going to, you know, be re-released into the wild. And if they're not shot by ranchers and stuff, they might have a chance at restoring the species. You know, so.
Just riffing on that, Miriam, do you want to talk a little bit about these reintroducing of species, these rewilding? I don't know. That's because one aspect of the loss is being addressed both by your celebration of the Billion Oyster Project, and, you know, Miriam's looking into this kind of state project of introducing animals into ecosystems that they haven't been in for millennia or ever.
So the new research that I'm doing now is about rewilding. And rewilding is really, it's kind of like a trendy name for ecological management, let's say, that has been being used in the last decade or maybe 2 decades. And the fundamental idea of rewilding is, as opposed to ecological conservation, which generally ecological conservation projects, they need to decide like what ecology are they conserving. So you need to find a point in time, because yes, at some point everything was glaciers, and then it was you know.
I could imagine a time and place, right? Because places are changing, right? Trees are moving north, you know, tundra's melting, right? So you could imagine going either way, to a stratum of a particular climatic moment or to a place in which these things
And there
would
are
now
new,
become home.
there are new projects like this, right? Like this idea of moving ecosystems north and so forth,
Yeah.
helping them. But generally, like around ecosystem conservation, you know, some projects were quite explicit. Like we are 1976. We are going to try to restore this little piece of land to how it was in 1976, and all the animals that species that were here, that are here now, that are kind of in the way, we're going to remove them and we're going to bring the others back. And at some point, I think after enough of these attempts, it's not possible, right? Like we
Right.
have fundamentally changed ecosystems, and rewilding really begins with the idea that it's not possible to restore back to kind of a pre-human time, and that this doesn't really exist. And that rather what we want to do is we do want to change ecosystems, but in order to rebalance the systemic health. And so kind of one of the fundamental practices of rewilding and of getting that health is by introducing animals that are high on the trophic cascade, and then kind of allowing them to manage the lands for us, which is also quite interesting, like this idea of, you know, maybe unwillingly enacting the labor of these animals to do some work for us. But there's also really interesting things that come along with it. For example, you know, in some ways it's like an unwinding of the scientific method, because we're not super clear. It's no longer like numbers that we're aiming for. Like we just want to fix the processes, and how you do that is this kind of descriptive, a bit unknown, which is quite interesting. Yeah, sorry, I'm getting...
Yeah, anyway.
You know, when they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, you know, Yellowstone without wolves suffered from sort of overabundance of ungulates, you know,
Yeah.
of deer and elk.
The
and stuff.
grazers.
Yeah, so they were eating too much of the ground cover, which is drying up the streams and changing the climate there. So when the wolves came back and started eating the deer, the growth came back, which cooled the land and restored some of the waters. So yeah, it's a complicated, you know, it's all so interrelated. But I think, you know, I don't know, it's like I love the idea of rewilding. I'm not sure that the wild application should be out there. I think we need de-wilding. I think we're the wild ones.
That's nice.
Can you say more about that?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, there's a sort of ethos to nature left to itself. You know, it's not Bambi, but it's its own sort of ethos. And, you know, human beings, by taking over this sort of dominant position in relation to nature, you know, have wreaked all sorts of havoc, you know, not only on the planet, but, you know, on these other species. So, who's the wild one? I mean, they don't seem wild. It seems like we're the wild ones. We're the ones who are.
You're taking up the moral
Yeah.
nature of the word.
Yeah. I mean, we were called wild men, right? The Dutch called us the wilde, you know. But I think they were wilder than us, you know.
But I guess there's in some sense, like, is it really possible for us to step out anymore? It's like, I really liked your comment about that, like, you don't have identity without relationality, and that it is like fundamentally always about renegotiating this.
I think an important historic perspective is, and you're deep into this kind of archaeology, is that humans have been doing things for a super long time. So recent botanical researchers in the British Isles, of all places, have decided that this kind of pine was brought by people from what is now, you know, Ukraine in 10,000 whatever, and this particular, you know, fir tree was brought from that. In other words, humans have been moving seeds around, they have been moving animals around, they have been crafting landscapes. I mean, the Native Americans crafted these landscapes to proliferate edge formations and wildlife and so on. So that would be another way to look at it, that we've always been here, but there are too many of us. That's one.
It's not just population, though. It's attitude, isn't it?
Of course.
I mean, so
Yeah.
it's culture, ultimately.
Yeah.
So then what do you do to change the culture? You know, I think empathy, I mean, art works sometimes through empathy because it jumps over some of the rational sorts of scientific and the sort of barriers that exist to just feeling something, like you feel like when you're with your pet or something. You don't.
Yeah.
There's that empathy generating aspect, but nothing's going to happen. We are in charge now. Whether we're responsible stewards or not, and nothing's going to happen without our stewardship. Hopefully, it can be wiser in the future.
Can we take some questions, maybe, if that's okay? Just I think we have about 10 more minutes or so. Who's brave enough to wade into the... Oh, should we get a microphone?
We have a microphone.
Okay, hang on for the ritual talking stick coming your way. Lynn Margulis, our patron saint, described humans as upright mammalian weeds. So I think we can live with that a little bit. Yeah.
This really isn't a question, but some information. You're talking about wilding. On the other side of the river from MIT, there's a promenade called the Charles River Esplanade, where the Hat Shell is, and bike paths and fields and trees and picnic areas and all sorts of things. But the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in Massachusetts has carved out plots from the river to the path, I'd say 20 or 30 feet wide and perhaps 100 feet long, and populated them with the grasses, with the plants, with the trees, and even the mosses going down to the river that existed not pre-human times, but when the river was pristine. And there are several plots, and they hope to use these wilding areas to spread the original flora and I guess the fauna will follow. So I just thought I'd mention that it's happening pretty close to here, that's all. And it seems, I run there regularly, and it seems successful. The plots are flourishing. That's all I have to say.
That's good.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation, for your work in the exhibit. I really enjoyed it. I know this is a panel on interspecies attentiveness, but I couldn't help but notice that there's a lot of geologic and place-based attentiveness in not only the decision of where to do the work, but how the work evolves. And I'm curious, from a process perspective, whether it's the geologic space that calls you to make art for it, or it's something else about maybe the relationship between different species that calls you to make art in a particular place. If you could speak to how you decide where to start a project, that'd be helpful.
Sure. So for the flower, the Agalanus acuta project, I was invited to make a work for this biennial happening in New York City called New York City Culture Makers. And so I just became really interested in thinking about other species as culture makers and other species in New York City. And this really does happen to be the only federally protected plant growing in New York City. And then I got, I think, pretty lucky because it has all these amazing stories attached to it. I kind of feel, at least for me, wherever you are, if you start to actually look, it's kind of totally incredible. And so often the place is like more of a less sexy, practical, or just kind of happenstance situation. And then once you go down, it's like infinite unfoldings.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's hard to know what prompts art ideas.
Well, you have such a deep historical practice. I mean, that was also a question I had. It's like, where do you find these materials? I mean, what archives are deep enough and rich enough to find some of this information?
Well,
or is some of it?
That first piece I showed, Earth's Eye, is sort of a banner piece for me because it gave me the really the tools of my practice, which was going to involve researching discrete sites, and the sites were going to be somehow contextualized within invitations and shows and things like that. So Storm King, which is up the Hudson a bit, I thought of its land, and I thought, yeah, it was Lenape, it was Munsee territory, and that got me thinking about our similarities with the Munsees, with the clan animals, and I always thought it would be really interesting to do something with the fact that we call ourselves turtles or wolves or things like that, and so that led to more research, and then finding, again, happenstance, this Wolf Conservation Center, and then my own sort of screen addictions, watching these wolves. And then I just wanted to do something else with that footage, So I sometimes use other footage. I shot the footage for the oyster piece, but and I like to be on boats when I do that because it's fun, and it's a great way to look at a city is from a boat, because it's different, and it's there's not that friction. And it looks great, too. If you set a tripod up in a boat and it's smooth water, it looks like Steven Spielberg shot it.
Hi, thank you so much. I just have a question. We often speak of nature and humans as being opposing, right? We say that we've detached ourselves from nature. Like, what gives us that right? This idea that our advancements aren't natural, right? That we have to go in and control nature when very much we're at the mercy of it, whether it be natural disasters or what so. So I guess when we speak about our technological advancements, is that not part of nature? Are our advancements not nature? Why do we think we can control nature with technology?
So are you saying, we shouldn't exclude our technology from nature?
No, I mean, you wouldn't tell a beaver that its dam is not nature. So why are our housing, our technology not nature?
I should point out that the beaver is MIT's totem animal, okay? It's our totem animal. One comment I would have for you is this word itself is invented to produce a difference. So in working on the show, I was very conscious of choosing words like life. No one wants to be separated from life. No one finds it advantageous to say, well, I don't have anything to do with life. Now, technology, well, that's a very big question. I think we need to be aware that anything we don't call technology is something we have, quote, naturalized. So writing is a technology. Talking is a human techne. These are all technes of one kind, and they have become customary, and thus we say they might be naturalized. So I don't think that this is as binary as you suggest. I think that these are very fluid, and people use these words to make these differences. And then you can say, oh, why are you making that difference? Right? So that would be my approach. There is a tendency among some of our technological innovators to say, what's wrong with orbiting my Tesla around the planet? I mean, I'm nature, the planet is nature, my Tesla is nature, right? So part of me would resist your question and want more specificity about what kinds of technologies you consider could be part of this living system. So anyway, that's a bit of a speech. Are we over? No, we have some more time. That's good.
Well, I thought that was a great question. I mean, I think that's really, a very deep, insightful question. The beaver dam, but, beehive, all these other animals are doing precisely. Having a discussion like this, yeah, sure, we're using a microphone, but we're still having emotions. We're still, addressing each other, looking at each other. This is part of our lattice work. This is how humans work. This is actually how we succeed. And plants don't have that capability. I mean, let's face it. And, wolves, so forth. We've done
Špela
things.
would disagree, but we can come back to that.
Say it again?
Špela would disagree. Plants do have ways
She
of
may
communicating.
disagree. That doesn't matter. If she wants to debate the plants about it, that's fine, and she can interpret. But in fact, they can't. And anyway, it's an interesting topic. So I was just going to push back on one comment that you said, that there are too many of us. So I would like anybody who feels to be one extra person, to disappear. But nobody wants to do that. We're all part of this together, and we work on things, and we have all different kinds of stopgap mechanisms within ourselves that are very, very complicated. And rabbits say reproduce quickly, at least metaphorically. We don't. We are very deliberative about what we do, and we space our interests and our time according to the resources. We're very complicated beings. And I think we get minimized. I don't think we have a bad rap as humans because we've done so much. We shouldn't be downplaying ourselves as winners, And the fact of the matter is that we've taken up a lot of space, yes, but we are, frankly, the most fascinating, frankly, the only, I think, literate animal on Earth. And so having a benefit like this to be able to talk about it is wonderful. But we're the ones who have the space because we have the technology. And technology itself, the etymology, is art and craft. And that's the technos, and the logos is the word. So it's the word about the art and craft. That's exactly what you're doing is technology in a sense, because you're talking about art.
Word.
Yeah, it's really hard to parse all this stuff.
I just will push back on behalf of Špela. There are plant communication systems, and there are plant insect communication systems, and there are plant fungi communication systems. We are only beginning to listen. So I'm just going to make that statement. Huh? Yeah.
I mean, they're not also communicating, they're also saying what you're doing is wrong. We're just hearing that also. Like human history throughout centuries, people demonstrated there's like, you can't do this. We got over colonization. We made so many advances in history and human history. Now we can quote unquote say forest fires or floods are telling us that, well, your technology is kind of changing a balance here and there. We're reacting. So there's the technologies make us hear those moments of like revolt of non-humans, or you can just ignore that and just keep doing what you're doing, and it goes. No one can answer that, I guess.
Does anyone have a question back there? I feel like this part of the room is dominating. Yeah, I'm going to keep it a little dark, just so we can stay here. But I'm going to go in a little bit of a different direction. So I really liked the beginning of sort of the conversation here. First of all, thank you all. But we said, you said something about like humans not anthropomorphizing. I have a problem with that word. But it got me thinking about like how else could humans understand nature? You kind of have to do that. Then that led me to, well, why do humans need to understand? Then that leads to, well, how relevant do we think humans are? What are our assumptions about that? Which is like to your comment. And then that got me thinking about the artist in the video saying, in relation to the algorithm, we could all be plants. So that takes me to AI and all the conversations about AI actually becoming artists itself. And so I'm wondering, from your perspectives, how AI comes up in sort of the interspecies attentiveness in the conversation, because the assumption of relevance or the human relevance is like kind of underlying all of this conversation. But when we're not relevant anymore, does it mean that AI will have its own anthropomorphication, of like nature? Question.
Is that a question of like, is AI even capable of anthropomorphizing a different?
I drew a circle from the question back to this idea of the algorithm thinking we're all plants, and like the relevance of humanity.
I think her comment was like, we might as well be plants, in the sense of the algorithm is agnostic, is sort of the point she was making. Now, I might argue differently that the algorithm is written entirely by humans and benefits from hundreds of thousands of hours of human labor tagging something as a Dali painting, or tagging something else as a Marc Chagall, or tagging something else as a Cubist painting, right? So ChatGPT or Dali, the information they have is information entirely created by humans. So they're beautiful oceans of puppetry around human words and human ideas that are being kind of brilliantly synthesized and stacks of, machine learning algorithms. I mean, but I would argue it's nothing but anthropomorphic, and maybe that's fine, but anything it would have to tell us about vegetal otherness will be what we have already told it about vegetal otherness. So anyway, that's my own.
It's making me wonder, though, about the last piece that Špela presented, which I may be understanding incorrectly, but what I understood was that she was kind of training an AI based on the activity of the plants. Is that what you understood?
We don't know exactly what she was doing, but she was certainly training the AI to be available to the tendrils of the cucumber.
Mm-hmm.
And there was the wonderful moment where the cucumber kind of wandered over, changed its mind, wandered over, and finally connected and began to whatever that word is.
So there is like a kind of active attentiveness there.
Yeah.
And that makes me think there is potential for machine learning from the plant activity.
I mean, maybe Špela is starting that. Maybe hers will be the first vegetally attentive AI. That would be nice.
I mean, there is a proposal within the rewilding community, and part of it is under the guise of this idea that, like humans, we need to get out of the way, but something still needs to manage the ecosystem. So there is this proposal around just like you have a self-driving car, you have an automated agent that can sense the environment, parse that information, and make decisions. Like there's already an AI that's killing invasive, kind of plant animals in the oceans in Australia. I mean, the AI is not super complicated, it's just an image identification system. But there is kind of this idea, and part of the data that it's trained on is, it's like filtered through humans still though, but it is kind of planetary data, not human data. But I don't see how you could ever get out of the anthropomorphization, because like both the data sets and the algorithms are created by us.
Well, Špela showed an interesting diagram that went by in about a second, and it looked a little bit like Jakob von Uxküll. So Uxküll is this, he's Estonian, but he, operates in Germany, but the fascists are on the rise, so he can't get a lab. Anyway, he becomes a theoretical biologist, and he actually tries to think about species and their semiotic worlds. And on the one hand, this is a profound way to defeat anthropomorphism, because the tick has no eyes, has no ears. Its entire exoskeleton senses light and shadow. So are you saying its exoskeleton is an eye? No, it's not, right? He's insisting on kind of species specificity. And then he tumbles in his prose over to the next paragraph. The tick, a blind and deaf highway woman, is ready to pounce. So, he has to anthropomorphize this creature in order to communicate to his human readers. But he's kind of precise about when he's doing either thing. And I think these brilliant artists are rather adept at that. So, Špela's aware of the kind of futility of her trying to achieve crest time, but also she talked about the protocols of practice, which made her think about that question and think about what crest time would be like for the crest, right? So I'm not anti-human, by the way, my friend in the middle. I think humans haven't.
There were too many of us.
I was
assuming you didn't include
I think that population control has fallen out of the environmental conversation. I just point that out. Okay.
I'm only saying
what I do want to grant to humans is their imagination, which I think is a beautiful tool for achieving interspecies attentiveness.
It's
intraspecies we have trouble with.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's a good note to end on.
I was kind of thinking of that, like, wrap-up thing, but I don't want to cut any questions off. But we can also talk informally.
Well, I just had one more thought, which is thinking about the tick. I think what anthropomorphizing other species does for us is it encourages empathy, and Špela talked about that. So there is a certain value in that. But as everyone has also acknowledged, we lose something in the activity of doing that because we're, mapping things onto other species that are applicable to humans and not actually understanding their own activities as they are, just the light and shadow. But it still serves a purpose, and there is some value to what empathy can produce. Well, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you both for your work and your presentations.